The black Mercedes limousine didn't even slow down as it failed to make the turn. At 2:30 a.m. on May 30, 2009, on a dark stretch of highway near the town of Kazatin in Vinnytsia Oblast, the vehicle carrying 63-year-old Vladimir Kisel flew off the road at high speed and slammed directly into a concrete pole. The impact was catastrophic. The man known throughout Kyiv's criminal underworld as Dead, the grandfather, died instantly. Within hours, whispers began circulating through the capital's streets. Was it really an accident? Or had someone finally settled accounts with the last surviving crime boss from Ukraine's violent 1990s? The timing seemed too convenient. Just 6 years earlier, a bomb had exploded in his Jeep on Raitarska Street in central Kyiv, killing his driver on the spot and severing his bodyguard's leg. Yet Kisel himself had walked away without a scratch. Many believed that hit was ordered by another criminal authority, known as Prisht. Now, Dead was dead on a lonely highway, and the era of Kyiv's organized crime was closing with him. But this ending was merely the final chapter in a story that began decades earlier, in the grimy world of Soviet sports facilities and black market currency exchanges. Vladimir Karpovich Kisel was born on February 1, 1946, in the village of Hrihorivka near Kyiv. Like many future criminals of his generation, he channeled his physical aggression into sport, becoming a master of Greco-Roman wrestling and graduating from the Kyiv Institute of Physical Culture. His athletic career showed promise. He possessed the discipline, strength, and competitive drive that could have taken him to Soviet championship levels. Instead, something darker called to him. The structured world of official sports couldn't satisfy his ambitions. He wanted more than medals and state-sponsored glory. He wanted real power, real money, and the kind of respect that came not from judges' scorecards, but from fear. His criminal career began modestly, but violently. On November 20, 1981, the Darnytsky District Court of Kyiv sentenced Vladimir Kisel to 4 years in prison for robbery. He was 35 years old, already past the age when most men were settling into legitimate careers, but prison, rather than reforming him, became his criminal university. He worked as a warehouse manager at the colony, a position that gave him access to goods, contacts, and the informal power structures that governed life behind bars. When he returned to freedom in the mid-1980s, he didn't go back to wrestling. Instead, he dove into card sharking and gambling scams, using his athlete's discipline and quick mind to cheat players across Kyiv. But these were small-time operations, barely worth the effort for a man of his intelligence and ambition. Everything changed in the late 1980s as the Soviet Union began its terminal collapse. The economic chaos of perestroika created opportunities that men like Kisel had been waiting for their entire lives. The VDNH, the Exhibition of Achievements of National Economy, became ground zero for Kyiv's emerging criminal world. Suddenly, crowds of shadow dealers and black marketeers flooded the exhibition grounds, drawn by the massive flows of people and untraceable cash. The old Soviet system of official prices and controlled distribution was disintegrating, replaced by a chaotic free-for-all where everything was for sale and violence determined who controlled what. According to law enforcement sources, this is where Vladimir Kisel established his base of operations, recognizing before many others that the exhibition complex represented a goldmine of protection rackets, smuggling routes, and money laundering opportunities. But in the late 1980s, Kisel wasn't yet a boss. He was still climbing, still working for someone else. And this is where his story takes its first truly dark turn. A betrayal so complete that it would define his entire criminal philosophy for the next 2 decades. Vladimir Kisel and his son Vadim worked as drivers for a Kyiv criminal authority known by the street name Vata. They earned regular salaries as what the criminal world called sixes, the lowest tier of the hierarchy, essentially muscle and errand boys. They saw with their own eyes the kind of money that passed through their boss's hands every day. They watched Vata collect tributes from businesses, settle disputes, and live like a king while they scraped by on fixed wages. The life of subordinates didn't suit the Kisels. They didn't want to be employees in the criminal world. They wanted to be owners. So father and son made a decision that would become legend in Kyiv's underworld. They organized the murder of their own benefactor, the man who had given them work, who had trusted them with his life as his drivers, who had brought them into the criminal world. They killed him. The details of how Vata died have been lost to time, but the message was clear. Vladimir Kisel had announced that he was willing to do absolutely anything to reach the top. Loyalty, gratitude, honor among thieves, these meant nothing to him. Only power mattered. And with Vata eliminated, the Kisels seized control of his operations and began building their own organization. The early 1990s were a period of almost incomprehensible violence and chaos in Kyiv. The Soviet Union's collapse had left Ukraine independent but economically devastated. Official institutions were weak or non-existent. Police were underpaid and easily corrupted. Legitimate businesses struggled, while criminal enterprises flourished. Into this void stepped dozens of organized criminal groups, each fighting viciously for control of the city's most profitable territories. The Hotel Mir on the left bank of the Dnipro River became the nerve center of Kisel's growing empire. According to law enforcement estimates, up to $500,000 in untaxed cash flowed through this single location every month. The hotel wasn't just a meeting place. It was a criminal bank, a court, and an execution chamber all rolled into one. Across from the Hotel Mir lay Holosievsky Park, and this seemingly innocent green space became a dumping ground for bodies. "Do you know how many bones are still buried there?" one former detective would later ask journalists. "So many graves. So many." The park's recreational facilities, trading stalls, small restaurants, attractions, casinos, all operated under Kisel's protection. Anyone who wanted to do business there paid tribute to dead. Anyone who refused often ended up buried among the trees. Law enforcement would later conduct one major raid on the Hotel Mir, detaining approximately 80 members of Kisel's organization in a single sweep. But charges rarely stuck. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Prosecutors found reasons to drop cases. The system was already deeply corrupted. Kisel's organization specialized in every classic criminal enterprise of the era: contraband smuggling across newly porous borders, armed robberies of businesses and individuals, extortion and protection rackets targeting anyone with money, black market currency operations as the Ukrainian economy lurched between hyperinflation and collapse, and most profitably, Krisha, the Russian term for protection, literally meaning roof. Restaurants, shops, markets, and entertainment venues all needed protection in the lawless 1990s. Those who didn't pay Kisel's organization faced vandalism, violence, or worse. Those who did pay found their businesses left alone, their disputes settled, their competitors warned off. But what distinguished Kisel from most criminal bosses of his era was a crucial strategic insight that would ensure his long-term survival. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who bled their protected businesses dry, extracting every possible ruble until the enterprise collapsed, Kisel took a different approach. He let businesses grow. He didn't demand such high tribute that owners couldn't invest in expansion. He settled disputes fairly, rather than simply favoring whoever paid more. He provided genuine protection, rather than just collecting money and disappearing. The result was that half of Ukraine's successful businessmen in the 2000s and 2010s, many of whom would later become members of parliament, had once operated under Kisel's roof in the 1990s. They didn't hate him. In many cases, they were grateful to him. He had helped them survive and prosper in an impossible environment. This created a network of loyalty that would prove invaluable when Kisel began his transition from pure criminal to legitimate businessman and politician. By the mid-1990s, his interests extended far beyond protection rackets and street-level crime. His organization controlled operations in metallurgy, mining and processing plants, international automobile transportation, automobile smuggling, hospitality services, entertainment venues, and the rapidly growing gambling industry. These weren't just criminal fronts. Many were actual functioning businesses that generated legitimate profits while also serving as money laundering operations. Kisel's empire spanned virtually all regions of Ukraine, with tentacles reaching into every sector of the economy. The geographical reach of his power was equally impressive. He controlled the zoo market in the Kuranivka district, the Zhitny market in Podil, and crucially, from November 1990 onward, the Volodymyrsky market, one of Kyiv's most profitable commercial zones. This latter acquisition came after police defeated a rival criminal group led by Alexander Onischenko, who operated under the street name Kadyrov. When that organization collapsed, Kisel moved in immediately, appointing his lieutenant Teplitsky to run operations. Teplitsky understood that pure muscle wouldn't sustain a large criminal business. He maintained close connections with lawyer Yaroslav Hanchuk, who provided not just legal protection for the organization's activities, but also tips on wealthy individuals who might be targeted for extortion or fraud. The left bank of the Dnipro became Kisel's primary territory, though he also maintained significant operations on the right bank. For a while, the left bank was fatter than the right, one former detective recalled. Yes, there were markets on the right bank, Zhitny, Sinyi, Volodymyrsky, but the left bank had the new money, the new developments, the places where post-Soviet entrepreneurs were building fortunes. The Yunost market became another key battleground, with various criminal groups fighting viciously for control. Kisel's organization usually won these fights, not just through superior violence, but through superior organization and political connections. Because by the mid-1990s, Vladimir Kisel was no longer just a criminal. He had begun his transformation into something far more dangerous. A criminal who had successfully penetrated the legitimate political system. He was elected deputy of his home Moskovsky District Council, then later to the Holosyevsky District Council. These weren't ceremonial positions. They gave him official immunity from certain prosecutions, advance warning of police operations, and the ability to influence municipal contracts and development projects. He sat in council meetings alongside ordinary politicians, voting on city budgets and development plans, all while running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Ukraine. His son Vadim was following the same path, being groomed to eventually take over the empire. In the mid-1990s, Berkut Special Forces stopped a vehicle on Druzhby Narodov Avenue in Kyiv. Inside they found an entire arsenal of weapons, assault rifles, handguns, ammunition, everything needed to equip a small military unit. Behind the wheel sat Vladimir Kisel, the boss's son. For any ordinary citizen, this would mean years in prison. For Vladimir Kisel, the case simply dissolved, the polite euphemism used when charges disappeared through corruption. No trial, no conviction, no consequences. Throughout independent Ukraine's history, from 1991 until his death in 2009, law enforcement never managed to bring any serious charges against Vladimir Kisel or his son. This wasn't because they were careful or left no evidence. Investigators and operatives spent decades risking their lives to build cases against the organization, collecting evidence piece by piece, documenting crimes, identifying witnesses. The work was dangerous. Several officers involved in investigating Kisel's organization died in suspicious circumstances. Others were transferred to remote posts. Some simply gave up and quit the force. The titanic effort of dozens of people over nearly 2 decades produced mountains of evidence, yet almost none of it resulted in court sentences. The reason was simple and devastating. Kisel's criminal empire succeeded because numerous prosecutors, judges, generals, and lower-ranking officers fed from his hands. The corruption was systemic and complete. In December 1997, a remarkable meeting took place that illustrated exactly how the system worked. Vereskin, a department head in Kyiv's UBOP, the Department for Fighting Organized Crime, met personally with Vladimir Kisel. The crime boss promised that negative publications about law enforcement in the press would stop if officers didn't interfere with him or his commercial structures. Vereskin, speaking on behalf of law enforcement leadership, assured Kisel that he had nothing to worry about. Later, Vereskin would break this promise and authorize operations against some of Kisel's businesses. But the very fact that such a meeting could take place shows how thoroughly organized crime had corrupted the system. The network of protection extended to the very top of Ukrainian politics. In February 1996, Vladimir Kisel celebrated his 50th birthday with a lavish party at a Kyiv restaurant. This wasn't a secret gathering of criminals in some underground bunker. It was a public celebration attended by Deputy and former Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs Valentin Nedrigailo, who had served in that position from 1992 to 1994. Smaller deputies attended. Officials from city leadership came to pay their respects. Businessmen lined up to demonstrate their loyalty and deliver their tribute. The message was clear. Kisel operated not in the shadows, but in plain sight, with the explicit protection of some of Ukraine's most powerful political figures. But even as Kisel consolidated his domestic power, he was building connections that would link him to international organized crime networks reaching into the United States itself. In September 1996, a man named Alexander Presman arranged a trip that would define the next phase of Kisel's criminal evolution. Presman took Vladimir Kisel to the United States for a specific purpose: to meet with Semion Mogilevich, whom Western law enforcement agencies considered the absolute boss of bosses of Russian-Ukrainian organized crime worldwide. The FBI had identified Mogilevich as controlling a massive international criminal network. He would later be placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list and remain there for years. During this meeting in the United States, Presman introduced Kisel as the leader of a criminal organization whose enforcement structure would provide roofs, protection, and muscle to businesses operating within Mogilevich's international criminal syndicate. This wasn't a casual introduction. It was a formal alliance being proposed between Kyiv's most powerful criminal organization and a global network that spanned from Los Angeles to Geneva. Mogilevich's operations at that time included companies registered in Canada but operating in the United States, bank accounts in Stockholm and New York, money flows through Geneva, and ultimate destinations in offshore zones in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. The scale was staggering. Between 1993 and 1998, Mogilevich allegedly ran schemes that defrauded thousands of investors of over $150 million. His company, YBM Magnex International, registered in Canada but doing business in the United States, eventually collapsed amid fraud investigations. In 1999, USA Today published revelations about the Bank of New York scandal, alleging that money laundering occurred through 4 accounts at Bank of New York and 1 at Republic National Bank, all opened under the company name Benex. The newspaper, citing intelligence sources, claimed that Semion Mogilevich was the founder of BNX. The FBI would eventually offer a reward of $5 million for information leading to Mogilevich's arrest, one of the highest bounties ever offered for a white-collar criminal. And Vladimir Kisel had just allied his organization with this man. The implications were enormous. Kyiv's criminal networks were no longer isolated post-Soviet gangs fighting over street markets. They were now connected to a global infrastructure for money laundering, fraud, and organized crime that operated across multiple continents. Kisel's protected businesses in Ukraine could now access international financial services. His smuggling operations could link into established routes reaching Western Europe and North America. His money could be cleaned through the sophisticated offshore structures that Mogilevich controlled. Presman himself became a crucial link in this network. After his American partners, Semion Mogilevich and Moni Elson, began having serious problems with U.S. law enforcement, Presman immigrated to Ukraine. He maintained close contact with Vladimir Kisel, serving as his connection to the international criminal world. In the 2000s, Presman worked as an assistant to several Ukrainian deputies and later as an advisor to the Minister of Transport. His circle of contacts included other major criminal authorities and their fronts, figures known by street names like Seva, Mogilevich, Antimos, Kuhilava, Vacha, Vakhtang Uberia, as well as politicians like Deputy Mikhail Brodsky and the influential Circus brothers. For a while in the late 1990s, Vladimir Kisel, Vladimir's son and designated heir, served as Presman's trusted contact in Ukraine while Presman was operating from abroad. This arrangement ensured continuous coordination between Kyiv's criminal operations and the international networks. Money, information, and criminal opportunities flowed both ways. The FBI had identified at least 10 important associates of Mogilevich actively operating in Ukraine, including Kyiv criminal leaders like Igor Tkachenko, street name Cherep or Skull, who was part of what intelligence called the Golden Seven of Kyiv's criminal bosses, and Iskander Kirimov, street name Tatarin or Tatar, another leader of a Kyiv criminal community. But while Kisel was building these international connections, he was simultaneously constructing an entirely different public image that would become his greatest protection. He began positioning himself not as a criminal, but as a legitimate businessman, sports administrator, and even a benefactor of the Orthodox Church. He became president of the All-Ukrainian Federation of Greco-Roman Wrestling, the same sport he had once excelled at before choosing the criminal path. This wasn't just a ceremonial title. He used the position to build connections throughout Ukrainian sports administration and to create legitimate reasons for international travel. He was appointed to Ukraine's National Olympic Committee, giving him another layer of official respectability. Even more brazenly, Kisel began what could only be called a campaign of religious philanthropy. He actively supported Orthodox churches, funded restoration projects, and donated substantial sums to religious institutions. He even publicly declared his intention to become a monk, a statement so audacious that it became darkly comic to those who knew his real activities. Here was a man responsible for countless beatings, extortions, and murders, talking about monastic vows and spiritual devotion. Yet the churches accepted his money. Priests blessed him. Religious institutions listed him as a major benefactor. The strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. By 2000, Vladimir Kisel's Wikipedia entry, which he or his associates carefully managed, described him as Ukrainian sportsman and public figure, master of sports in Greco-Roman wrestling, president of the All-Ukrainian Federation of Greco-Roman Wrestling, member of Ukraine's National Olympic Committee. No mention of organized crime. No reference to the bodies in Holosivsky Park, or the extortion rackets, or the international criminal networks. Just sports and public service. Anyone researching him for business dealings or political partnerships would find this sanitized version first. The criminal past was buried under layers of legitimate achievement. This wasn't accidental. Kisel understood something that many of his criminal contemporaries missed. In the new Ukraine, pure violence was a dead end. The truly successful criminals would be those who could transform their illegal fortunes into legal businesses and political power. He studied how Italian and American Mafia families had made similar transitions. He recognized that the second generation, his son Vadim, would need to operate in a different world, where crude street tactics would be replaced by corporate structures and political influence. The Wrestling Federation wasn't just a front. It was a machine for generating legitimate income, international contacts, and social respectability that could be passed down to his heirs. The Hotel Mir continued to serve as the primary headquarters, but it was now just one node in a much larger network. Kisel's organization expanded beyond traditional criminal enterprises into sectors that offered enormous profits with less direct violence. Metallurgy became a major focus. Ukraine's steel industry was being privatized in chaotic auctions, where criminal muscle often determined the winners. Mining and processing plants in eastern and central Ukraine came under his influence through complex ownership structures that hid his involvement behind multiple shell companies. International automobile transportation gave his organization control over smuggling routes, while also generating legitimate revenue. The automobile smuggling operation itself was sophisticated and profitable. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine's customs system was notoriously corrupt. Luxury vehicles could be brought across the border with falsified documentation or simply with appropriate bribes to border guards. Kisel's organization had the connections to make this happen at scale. Stolen cars from Western Europe would be driven to Ukraine, given new identities through corrupt officials, and sold to wealthy Ukrainians eager for status symbols. The profit margins were enormous, and the risks were minimal given how thoroughly the organization had corrupted the relevant agencies. Real estate became another major investment. Kisel bought up properties on Krasnoarmyska Street in central Kyiv, prime commercial and residential real estate that would appreciate enormously as Ukraine's economy stabilized. One of the capital's most famous restaurants, Evrika, was registered under his son's name. Vadim also appeared as a founder of the Mirage Bowling Club. They opened an upscale pizzeria in central Kyiv. These weren't just money laundering operations. They were actual businesses that catered to Kyiv's emerging middle and upper classes. Customers eating pizza or bowling had no idea they were patronizing establishments owned by one of Ukraine's most powerful criminal organizations. The gambling and entertainment industry offered particularly rich opportunities. Casinos operated in a legal gray zone during much of the 1990s and 2000s, generating massive cash flows that were difficult for authorities to track. Kisel's organization controlled numerous gambling establishments across Kyiv, taking a percentage of every bet, while also using the venues for money laundering. $1 million in dirty money from extortion or smuggling could be won at a casino controlled by the organization, emerging as clean gambling winnings with proper documentation. The system was elegant and nearly impossible to prosecute. But the true genius of Kisel's operation lay in how thoroughly he had corrupted Ukraine's law enforcement and judicial system. This wasn't just a matter of paying off individual officers. The corruption was structural and institutional. Former Minister of Internal Affairs Yuri Smirnov, when he was chief of Kyiv's police, complained bitterly about the situation. The Kisels, the Prishks, the Rybkas live peacefully and grow fat, becoming benefactors, deputies at various levels, appearing on television and in the press, sharing their rich life experience. One of the leaders of a special unit affectionately calls the leader of Kisel's criminal organization Karpovich. The frustration in Smirnov's words was palpable. Here was the police chief himself admitting that major criminals operated with complete impunity. The protection network extended into the prosecutor's office, the courts, and the security services. Judges who might have been inclined to rule against Kisel's interests found themselves transferred to remote positions or facing their own investigations into fabricated corruption charges. Prosecutors who pursued cases too aggressively received warnings through intermediaries. Back off or face consequences. Some were offered bribes so large that refusal became economically irrational. Others were threatened with violence against their families. The few who remained incorruptible found their cases sabotaged by colleagues, with evidence disappearing from storage or witnesses suddenly recanting their testimony. The scale of this corruption becomes clear from a single example. Throughout independent Ukraine's entire existence, from 1991 until 2009, law enforcement never managed to convict Vladimir Kisel or his son Vadim on any serious charges. Not one. This despite years of surveillance, dozens of investigations, and mountains of evidence documenting everything from extortion to smuggling to violent assault. Officers who worked these cases knew exactly what crimes had been committed and by whom. They had witness statements, financial records, surveillance footage. But the cases never reached trial, or if they did, judges found reasons to dismiss them, or witnesses suddenly developed amnesia on the stand. One detective who worked on investigating Kisel's organization for years later described the experience to journalists. "We would build a case for months, document everything perfectly, get all the evidence we needed. Then we would send it up the chain of command, and it would just stop. Sometimes we'd get calls telling us to drop it. Sometimes the evidence would be lost. Sometimes our witnesses would recant. After a while, you realize the system isn't designed to prosecute people like Kisel. It's designed to protect them." The detective, who spoke on condition of anonymity, had since left law enforcement entirely, disgusted by the corruption he had witnessed. In 2003, a rare attempt was made to actually charge Kisel with something substantial. Ukrainian authorities opened several criminal cases regarding tax evasion and securities fraud, and some of Kisel's business structures became targets. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the untouchable crime boss might actually face consequences. Business associates began distancing themselves. Some of his protected entrepreneurs quietly sought other roofs, hedging their bets in case Kisel's protection was about to collapse. Rumors circulated that he had suffered a heart attack from the stress. Rumors that were never confirmed, but that suggested the pressure was real. But the cases fizzled out just like all the others. Prosecutors claimed insufficient evidence. Witnesses became unavailable. Some charges were dropped entirely. Others were reduced to administrative violations with small fines. By the end of 2003, Kisel's empire was intact, and he had survived yet another challenge. The message to law enforcement was clear. There would be no successful prosecution of this man, no matter what evidence existed. The level of protection he enjoyed came from too high up in the political system to overcome. This protection manifested in surreal ways. The Hotel Mir, despite being widely known as a criminal headquarters, continued operating openly. The UBOP conducted one major raid in the late 1990s, detaining approximately 80 members of Kisel's organization who happened to be meeting there. It should have been a devastating blow. 80 arrests in one operation, all of them connected to the same criminal group. In any functioning legal system, This would have led to dozens of prosecutions, convictions, lengthy prison sentences. Instead, almost everyone detained was released within days. A handful faced minor charges that resulted in small fines or suspended sentences. None of the organization's leadership was seriously impacted. The meeting culture at Hotel Mir continued unabated. Other criminal authorities regularly visited to meet with Kisel and coordinate activities. Among the frequent guests were figures known by their street names: Kupets, the merchant; Tatarin, the Tatar; Avdishev, Rybka, the fish; and Savlokhov. These weren't casual social visits. They were criminal summits where territory was divided, disputes were settled, and coordinated operations were planned. Law enforcement knew these meetings were happening. Surveillance teams documented who came and went, but nothing was done to stop them. The criminals weren't even particularly careful about their activities. They met in public restaurants, drove luxury cars with known license plates, lived in expensive homes registered under their own names or those of immediate family members. The traditional mafia obsession with secrecy and compartmentalization simply wasn't necessary in an environment where the entire system was corrupted. Why hide when you have nothing to fear from police, prosecutors, or judges? Kisel's legitimate businesses continued to expand throughout this period. His interests in Ukraine's energy sector grew substantially. Reports suggested he had invested significant capital in Naftogaz Ukraini, the state-owned oil and gas company. The exact nature of these investments was opaque, hidden behind multiple layers of shell companies and offshore structures. But the fact that a known criminal could acquire significant interests in a strategic national company demonstrated just how thoroughly corruption had penetrated Ukraine's economy. His son Vadim was increasingly taking on operational responsibilities, preparing for the eventual succession. Unlike his father, who had come up through street crime and violence, Vadim was being groomed as a businessman and sports administrator. He held official positions in the Wrestling Federation. He appeared at public events. He cultivated a respectable image that bore no obvious connection to organized crime. This was precisely what Vladimir had planned. The second generation would complete the transition from criminal to legitimate that he had begun. The family's wealth was displayed openly. They owned multiple properties in Kyiv's most expensive neighborhoods. They drove Mercedes and BMW vehicles, the status symbols of Ukraine's new elite. They vacationed abroad, traveled to international sporting events, hosted lavish parties. None of this raised red flags with tax authorities because the money appeared to come from legitimate businesses: the restaurants, the bowling club, the real estate investments, the sports federation. The criminal profits had been so thoroughly laundered through this network of legal enterprises that tracking the original sources became nearly impossible. Former Kyiv UBOP chief Vitaly Yarema would later identify Kisel publicly as the leader of an organized criminal syndicate who had long since legitimized his business and engaged in church construction and other charitable activities, while never losing his influence in what people called the criminal world. But Yarema made these statements after leaving his position. While he was in office, no action had been taken against Kisel. The pattern was consistent. Former officials would acknowledge the truth after they no longer had the power to do anything about it. Current officials maintained careful silence, or worse, actively collaborated with the criminal networks. The relationship between Kisel's organization and the Orthodox Church deserves particular attention because it illustrates the complete moral bankruptcy of some religious institutions in post-Soviet Ukraine. Kisel didn't just donate money to churches. He effectively became a church patron, funding major restoration projects and construction. The Sviatopokrovsky Holosiivsky Monastery received substantial donations from him for restoration work. When he eventually died, he would be buried on the monastery grounds, a privilege normally reserved for major religious benefactors and clergy. The church accepted his money, knowing full well where it came from. Priests blessed him. Metropolitan bishops received him at religious functions. He was photographed at church events, standing alongside clergy in an image carefully cultivated to suggest piety and devotion. The disconnect between his public religious persona and his actual activities, the violence, the extortion, the corruption, was so extreme as to be almost satirical. Yet the church played along, perhaps believing that any money, regardless of its source, served God's purposes when used for religious construction. Or perhaps the clergy were simply as corrupted as the judges and police, willing to overlook any crime in exchange for generous donations. His public statements about potentially becoming a monk were particularly grotesque in this context. Here was a man who had ordered beatings and possibly murders, who had corrupted government officials, who ran protection rackets and smuggling operations, claiming he might renounce the world and enter monastic life? The statements were clearly tactical, designed to further burnish his image as a man of faith rather than a criminal. Yet they were reported in media without irony or questioning, as if they represented genuine spiritual aspirations rather than calculated public relations. The media treatment of Kisel more broadly reflected how thoroughly he had succeeded in controlling his public image. Journalists who wrote critically about him or his organization faced consequences. In one documented case, contact with Kisel was assigned to UBOP department head Vereskin. After meeting with Dead, Kisel promised he would speak with Mikhail Brodsky, a media figure connected to various publications. Following that conversation, critical articles about Kisel in the press stopped appearing. When Vereskin met with Kisel again in December 1997, the crime boss assured him that there would be no more publications if law enforcement didn't interfere with him or his commercial structures. Vereskin, speaking on behalf of law enforcement leadership, gave him that assurance. This was literal censorship through intimidation, coordinated between criminals and supposedly independent media. Publications that might have exposed Kisel's activities were silenced through threats or through deals with corrupted editors and publishers. Journalists who persisted in investigating faced harassment, professional destruction, or worse. The few media outlets that did report on organized crime learned to use careful language, describing Kisel as alleged or suspected, even when his activities were documented fact. The combination of legal threats and physical intimidation created an environment where investigative journalism into organized crime became nearly impossible. Kisel's business partnerships further illustrate how criminal and legitimate worlds had merged. His relationship with businessman Mikhail Franchuk demonstrates the pattern. They jointly owned the upscale Mandarin Entertainment Center and a Chinese restaurant, high-end establishments that catered to Kyiv's wealthy elite. These were substantial investments requiring significant capital and sophisticated management. They weren't street-level rackets, but legitimate businesses that happened to have a crime boss as co-owner. In spring 2003, Kisel forced Franchuk out of these ventures, allegedly taking his share worth approximately $2 million. Franchuk had no legal recourse. You don't sue a man like Vladimir Kisel in Ukrainian courts. Another business partner, Alexander Presman, opened a joint venture with Kisel called Kyiv Sport Club. Presman never saw the money he invested and couldn't retrieve it. The pattern repeated with multiple associates. Enter business with Kisel, contribute capital and expertise, then get pushed out when Kisel decided he wanted full ownership. The victims couldn't turn to police or courts because the system was corrupted. They couldn't use criminal enforcement because Kisel's organization was more powerful. They simply had to accept their losses and move on. The only business relationships that seemed to work long-term were those where the partner had their own independent power base. The Circus brothers, for example, maintained connections with Kisel while building their own business and political empire. They had sufficient resources and influence to be treated as equals rather than subordinates. Similarly, his relationships with other criminal authorities like Tatarin and Vacha were based on mutual respect between powerful organizations, rather than dominance and submission. By the mid-2000s, Vladimir Kisel had achieved something remarkable and disturbing. He had become simultaneously one of Ukraine's most successful criminals and one of its most respected public figures. He was president of a national sports federation, member of the Olympic Committee, a district council deputy, a church benefactor, and the owner of legitimate businesses. He attended official functions, appeared at sporting events, gave interviews about wrestling and Ukrainian athletics. And underneath all of this, he remained exactly what he had always been: a violent criminal who had murdered his way to power and maintained it through systematic corruption and intimidation. The contradiction didn't seem to trouble him or those around him. In the moral vacuum of post-Soviet Ukraine, where the collapse of communist ideology had left no coherent value system in its place, Kisel's dual existence appeared almost normal. Criminals became politicians. Politicians became criminals. Businessmen used criminal methods. Criminals posed as businessmen. The lines had blurred so completely that distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate power became nearly impossible. His physical appearance and demeanor contributed to the image he cultivated. Unlike the stereotype of the flashy gangster, Kisel was described as intelligent, judicious, and balanced, not prone to impulsive actions. He had maintained his wrestler's discipline, avoiding heavy alcohol use and staying physically fit well into his 60s. Those who met him described a calm, thoughtful man who spoke carefully and seemed more like a successful businessman than a crime boss. This measured persona made it easier for politicians and officials to justify their relationships with him. He wasn't some crude street thug. He was sophisticated, cultured, a man they could do business with. But beneath the surface, the violence never stopped. Protection money still had to be collected. Competitors still had to be warned off or eliminated. Debts still had to be enforced. The organization still employed dozens of enforcers whose job was intimidation and violence. These men didn't appear at sporting events or church functions. They worked in the shadows, maintaining through fear and brutality the empire that Kisel presented to the world as legitimate business success. The final years of Kisel's life were marked by this increasing paranoia and defensive posture. The bombing had shown him his mortality. The investigations had demonstrated his political protection wasn't absolute. Associates noticed behavioral changes. He became more careful about his movements, varying his routes and schedules. His security increased. He spent more time at the monastery he supported, perhaps genuinely seeking some kind of spiritual peace, or perhaps just finding it a safer location than his usual haunts. Stories circulated, never confirmed, that he had developed relationships with much younger women, including teenagers. One allegedly bore him a son, which reportedly displeased his legitimate heir Vadim, who saw the potential for inheritance complications. On the night of May 29, 2009, Vladimir Kisel left Kyiv and headed west on the Zhytomyr highway. The exact purpose of his trip remains unclear. Some reports suggested he was traveling to one of his business properties. Others claimed he was visiting associates in western Ukraine. What is certain is that he was driving his Mercedes limousine personally, not being chauffeured as he usually was. This detail alone raises questions. A man of Kisel's wealth and status always had drivers. Why was he behind the wheel that night? The route took him through Vinnytsia Oblast, a region of farmland and small towns between Kyiv and the western border. As the night deepened, traffic on the highway thinned. By 2:30 a.m., the roads were nearly empty. Kisel was approaching the town of Kazatin, Still about 10 to 15 kilometers away, when he reached a section of highway known locally as dangerous, a series of curves that required reduced speed and careful attention. What happened next took only seconds. The Mercedes failed to navigate a turn. Instead of following the curve of the road, the vehicle continued straight, flying off the pavement at high speed. It crossed the shoulder, went airborne briefly, and then slammed directly into a concrete utility pole. The impact was catastrophic. The front of the luxury vehicle crumpled like paper. The engine was driven back into the passenger compartment. Vladimir Kisel died instantly, his body crushed by the collision forces. By the time emergency services arrived, there was nothing to be done. The scene was documented, photographs taken, measurements recorded. Local police filed their initial report. Single vehicle accident, driver failed to navigate curve, high speed likely a factor, driver deceased at scene. The body was transported to the morgue. Kisel's family was notified. Within hours, word began spreading through Kyiv that dead was dead. But almost immediately, questions emerged. Those who knew Kisel pointed out that he was an experienced driver who had driven that route many times. The curves weren't particularly sharp, certainly nothing that would challenge someone familiar with the road. The weather was clear that night, the road dry. There was no obvious mechanical failure that would explain the loss of control. So what happened? Did he fall asleep at the wheel? Have a sudden medical event like a heart attack or stroke? Or was this actually the second successful attempt on his life, disguised to look like an accident? The evidence supporting the accident theory was straightforward. Single vehicle, no witnesses, driver error. It happens thousands of times every year on highways around the world. A moment's inattention, a slight overcorrection, and physics takes over. A heavy vehicle at high speed cannot defy the laws of motion. Perhaps Kisel was tired. Perhaps he was distracted. Perhaps he was driving too fast and simply misjudged the curve. Death doesn't require conspiracy. Sometimes it's just statistics and bad luck. But the evidence supporting the assassination theory was equally compelling. Kisel had survived a car bomb 6 years earlier. Someone had wanted him dead then, and had demonstrated both capability and intent. That threat hadn't necessarily gone away just because the first attempt failed. If you wanted to kill someone and make it look like an accident, a single vehicle crash on a lonely highway at night would be nearly perfect. Drug him so he loses control. Tamper with the vehicle's steering or brakes. Run him off the road with another vehicle that then flees the scene. Force him to drive himself that night through threats or deception. The possibilities were numerous. Moreover, the timing seemed suspicious to some. Kisel was 63 years old and still actively involved in his business empire. He showed no signs of planning retirement or succession beyond the gradual transfer of responsibilities to Vadim that had been happening for years. His death created an immediate power vacuum in one of Ukraine's most influential criminal-turned-legitimate business organizations. Who benefited? That's always the key question in any suspicious death. Vadim inherited everything, certainly, but he was already the designated heir. Rival criminal organizations might have benefited from Kisel's removal, though by 2009 most of the violent competition of the 1990s had long since ended. Law enforcement showed little interest in investigating beyond the surface-level accident report. There was no detailed forensic analysis of the vehicle, no toxicology testing of Kisel's blood beyond standard screening, no serious consideration of whether the scene had been staged. This lack of investigative rigor could simply reflect the reality that most single-vehicle accidents are exactly what they appear to be. Or it could reflect the same corruption that had protected Kisel throughout his life, now protecting whoever might have arranged his death. The funeral became a spectacle that perfectly captured the contradictions of Kisel's life. He was buried on the grounds of the Sviatopokrovsky Holosiyevsky Monastery, the religious institution he had funded so generously. Hundreds attended the service, including politicians, businessmen, sports administrators, and figures from the criminal underworld. The Orthodox clergy performed the full funeral rites, blessing his body and commending his soul to God as if he were any ordinary faithful member of the church, rather than a man credibly accused of ordering violence and murder throughout his career. The location of his burial, on monastery grounds rather than in a public cemetery, represented a final triumph of money over morality. Only major benefactors and religious figures typically receive such burials. The church had thoroughly embraced the fiction that Kisel was a pious philanthropist rather than a criminal who had used church donations to launder his reputation. Standing at his graveside, listening to prayers for his soul, one would never know that this man had emerged from the violent criminal underworld of Soviet collapse, had allegedly murdered his own benefactor to seize power, had run protection rackets and smuggling operations, had corrupted officials and judges, had allied with international organized crime networks. The immediate aftermath of his death saw a remarkably smooth transition. Vladimir Kisel stepped fully into his father's roles as president of the All-Ukrainian Federation of Greco-Roman Wrestling and effective head of the family's business interests. There were no succession disputes, no fragmenting of the organization, no violent power struggles of the kind that had marked the 1990s. This orderly transition suggested either that Vladimir had prepared extremely well for his eventual exit, or that the entire nature of organized crime in Ukraine had evolved beyond the crude violence of earlier eras. Vadim presented a very different public face than his father. While Vladimir had come from street crime and bore the marks of that brutal world, Vadim was educated, polished, comfortable in international settings. He spoke foreign languages. He attended international sporting events as a federation president. He cultivated relationships with government officials and business leaders. To all outward appearances, he was exactly what he claimed to be, a sports administrator and businessman with no connection to organized crime. The criminal past was his father's generation. He represented the cleaned-up future. This transformation received its most grotesque validation in 2014, 5 years after Vladimir's death. Vladimir Kisel was awarded full cavalier status of the Order of Saint Prince Vladimir of the Russian Orthodox Church. This was one of Orthodoxy's oldest and most prestigious honors, given to church and public figures for significant contributions to religious life. The award ceremony was public and ceremonial. Vadim was photographed receiving the honor, standing among clergy and other recipients. Media covered the event positively, describing his charitable works and support for Orthodox Christianity. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. Here was the son and heir of one of Ukraine's most notorious crime bosses, a man who had inherited an empire built on violence and corruption, being honored by the church as a benefactor and righteous supporter of faith. The Order of Saint Prince Vladimir was being awarded to someone whose family wealth came directly from criminal activities: extortion, smuggling, racketeering. The church either didn't know this history, which seemed impossible given how extensively it had been documented in media and law enforcement reports, or didn't care, as long as the donations continued flowing. The Kisel family's successful transition from criminal to respectable within 2 generations illustrated a broader pattern in post-Soviet societies. The massive fortunes accumulated during the chaotic 1990s, whether through privatization schemes, natural resource exploitation, or outright criminality, had by the 2010s been largely legitimized. The oligarchs and businessmen who dominated Ukraine's economy in 2014 included many whose wealth originated in the same criminal underworld that had produced Vladimir Kisel. But time, strategic philanthropy, political connections, and society's short memory had allowed them to rebrand themselves as legitimate capitalists. Former law enforcement officials watched this transformation with a mixture of frustration and resignation. One retired investigator put it bluntly, "We spent decades trying to build cases against these people. We documented everything, the extortion, the smuggling, the violence, and none of it mattered. They became too powerful, too connected. And now their children are respectable members of society, receiving awards and honors. It makes you wonder what the point of law enforcement even is in a society this corrupted." The business empire Vadim inherited continued operating successfully. The restaurants stayed open. The real estate appreciated in value. The investments in metallurgy and transportation generated steady profits. The Wrestling Federation maintained its status as the governing body for the sport in Ukraine. All of it appeared completely legitimate, because, by the 2000s, it largely was legitimate. The criminal origins had been laundered so thoroughly through years of apparently lawful business operations that proving any current illegality became nearly impossible. This raises uncomfortable philosophical questions about crime, punishment, and social transformation. Should Vadim be held accountable for his father's crimes? He was involved in the organization from a young age. The 1990s weapons arrest proved that, but never convicted. By 2014, he had spent more years as a sports administrator than as an active criminal. At what point does a criminal organization's transformation into legitimate business become complete? When is it acceptable to stop treating the inheritors of criminal wealth as criminals themselves? Ukrainian society largely answered these questions with pragmatic acceptance. Plenty of powerful people had questionable backgrounds. Trying to untangle the criminal from the legitimate in Ukraine's business elite would implicate half the country's wealthiest families. Better to let the past stay buried and judge people by their current actions. This wasn't moral reasoning so much as exhausted resignation. The recognition that post-Soviet Ukraine's entire economic structure rested on foundations of questionable legality, and that trying to tear it all down would accomplish nothing except chaos. But some refused to forget. Journalists who had covered the violence of the 1990s, who had seen the bodies and documented the crimes, found the rehabilitation of the Kisel family obscene. They wrote periodic articles reminding readers of Vladimir's criminal past, of the protection rackets and the corruption. They noted acidly that the Wrestling Federation was now headed by the son of a murderous gangster. They questioned whether the Orthodox Church had any moral standards at all when it gave honors to such people. These articles appeared, were read by a few thousand people, and then disappeared into the archives. Public opinion remained largely indifferent. The broader context helps explain this indifference. By the time Vadim received his church honor in 2014, Ukraine was confronting much larger crises. The Euromaidan protests had just overthrown President Viktor Yanukovych. Russia had annexed Crimea. War was beginning in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. The country faced existential questions about its survival and future direction. Worrying about whether a sports federation president's father had been a criminal in the 1990s seemed trivial compared to these massive challenges. Public attention and moral outrage had to be rationed, and they were directed at immediate threats rather than historical crimes. The FBI's investigation of Mogilevich eventually stalled because he was living in Russia, which had no extradition treaty with the United States. Similarly, any attempt to investigate Kisel's possible connections to international criminal operations would have required cooperation from Ukrainian authorities, who were often corrupted or intimidated. The jurisdictional complexities of international organized crime created safe havens where criminals could operate beyond the reach of any single nation's law enforcement. This remains a fundamental challenge for combating transnational crime. Looking back at Vladimir Kisel's life from the perspective of 2026, 17 years after his death, what conclusions can be drawn? On one level, his story is simply a particularly successful example of a common pattern. Violent criminal rises during social chaos, builds empire through brutality and corruption, eventually transitions to quasi-legitimate businessman, dies wealthy and honored. This pattern repeated across the former Soviet Union in the 1990s and 2000s, producing hundreds of similar figures. But Kisel's story also reveals something specific about Ukraine's post-Soviet transition. The complete failure of law enforcement and judicial institutions to hold him accountable wasn't just individual corruption. It was systemic, institutional collapse. The ease with which he moved from crime to politics to philanthropy without meaningful opposition showed a society that had lost any shared understanding of right and wrong, legal and illegal. The fact that his son could inherit his empire and receive church honors just 5 years later showed how thoroughly this moral confusion had been normalized. The mystery of his death remains unsolved, and probably unsolvable at this remove. Was it really just an accident, a moment's inattention on a dark highway? Or was it the successful second attempt by whoever had tried to kill him in 2003? The lack of serious investigation means we'll never know with certainty. Perhaps that's fitting. A man who spent his entire life evading accountability and obscuring truth dies in circumstances that remain permanently ambiguous. There's a certain poetic justice in that, even if there was no legal justice. What is certain is that Vladimir Kisel's death marked the end of an era in Kyiv's criminal history. He was, according to law enforcement officials, the last surviving major criminal authority from the violent 1990s who remained active in the city. Others had died in gang wars, been assassinated, fled abroad, or been imprisoned. Kisel alone had survived and prospered, transforming himself from street criminal to respected public figure. With his death, that entire generation passed into history. The businesses continue. The money remains in family hands. The Wrestling Federation operates under his son's leadership. The churches he funded hold services attended by people who have no idea they worship in buildings paid for with criminal proceeds. The politicians he corrupted have mostly retired or died. The prosecutors and judges he bought have moved on to other positions. The system that enabled him has evolved, but not fundamentally changed. Ukraine in the 2020s still struggles with corruption, still sees blurred lines between criminal and legitimate business, still watches as wealth provides impunity. On a hill in Kyiv, Vladimir Kisel's grave sits on the grounds of the Sviatopokrovsky Holosievsky Monastery, surrounded by the religious institution he funded. Visitors to the monastery walk past his burial site, perhaps noticing the name on the marker, perhaps not. Most have no idea who he was or what he did. The full story of his crimes, his corruption, his violence, has been largely forgotten, except by aging detectives and journalists with long memories. The official version, sportsman, public figure, benefactor, has become the accepted narrative. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Vladimir Kisel's life. In societies where institutions fail and corruption becomes normalized, truth itself becomes negotiable. The man who murdered his benefactor and built an empire on violence and fear can become, in death and through strategic philanthropy, a respected public servant and religious supporter. His son can receive honors from the church. His businesses can operate without stigma. The crimes can be forgotten, the victims unremembered, the corruption unpunished. History, it turns out, really is written by the winners. And Vladimir Kisel, by any measure, won.